The rain came down so hard that Elena could not tell if the water on her face was from the sky or from her own eyes. She was running, her wedding gown soaked and heavy, dragging through the mud like a second skin she wanted to tear off. Behind her, the great house of Ashford still glowed with candlelight, full of guests who did not yet know the bride was gone. Ahead of her was only darkness, trees bending in the wind, and a narrow path she barely remembered from her childhood visits to this land. She did not look back. She could not. If she looked back, she was afraid she would see him standing there, smiling, the way he always smiled, as if nothing was wrong, as if he had not just destroyed her whole life with a few careless words spoken behind a closed door. It had happened only an hour before. She had gone looking for her hairpins, the silver ones that belonged to her mother, and had walked past the study without meaning to listen, but the door was open just a crack, and she heard her own name, and something in her chest told her to stop walking. She stood there in her wedding gown, veil still pinned loosely to her hair, and listened to Duke Adrian Ashford speak to her stepsister Margot, in a voice she had never heard him use before. Cold, calculated, amused. He was saying that once the marriage was signed and the land papers transferred, he would not need to keep pretending. He said Elena was sweet, but sweetness was not what interested him. He said the estate her father was giving as a dowry was worth more than any affection he could fake for a lifetime. And Margot, her own stepsister, had laughed softly and said she always knew Elena was too simple to see what was happening right in front of her. Elena had stood frozen for a long moment, her hand pressed against the wall to keep herself from falling. Then, something inside her, some quiet strength she did not know she had, told her to move. She did not scream. She did not confront them. She turned and walked quickly back through the halls, past servants who bowed to her, past flowers arranged for a celebration that would never happen the way anyone expected. She reached her room, grabbed a shawl, and slipped out through the side door that led to the garden, and then she ran. Now here she was, alone in the storm, with thunder rolling across the hills and her satin shoes ruined beyond repair. She reached an old gatehouse at the edge of the property, a small stone building that had once been used by the gardeners, long since abandoned. She pushed the door open and stumbled inside, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking from cold and from the shock of what she had just learned. She sat down on the dusty floor and pulled her knees to her chest. The rain hammered against the roof. Somewhere far away, she could hear the faint sound of music still playing at the house, as if the world had not just cracked apart beneath her feet. She thought of her father, who believed this marriage would secure their family's future. She thought of the vows she had practiced saying just that morning, vows about loyalty and love and forever. She had meant every word. She wondered if Adrian had ever meant a single one of his. She did not cry for long. Elena was not a woman who allowed herself to stay broken for more than a few minutes at a time. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up, pacing the small space of the gatehouse, trying to think clearly despite the cold seeping into her bones. She needed a plan. She could not go back to that house, not tonight, maybe not ever. She thought of her old friend Rosalind, who lived 2 villages away, a friend from her childhood who had always told her that nobility was not the same as goodness. Rosalind would take her in. Rosalind would not ask too many questions before offering a warm fire and a place to sleep. But the village was miles away, and the storm showed no signs of slowing. Elena peered through a gap in the gatehouse door and saw nothing but sheets of rain and darkness. She would have to wait until it eased, even a little, before she dared to walk further. She sat back down, wrapping the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and tried not to think about the warmth of the fires burning inside the house she had just fled. She thought instead about how she had met Adrian, nearly a year ago now, at a gathering hosted by a mutual family friend. He had seemed different then, or so she had believed. He had asked her about the books she liked to read, not about her father's land or her family's connections. He had laughed at something she said, a real laugh, not the polite kind people gave to daughters of wealthy men. She had let herself believe that a duke could fall for a woman simply because of who she was, not what she brought with her. She realized now, sitting in the cold and the dark, how foolish that belief had been. Or perhaps it was not foolish to hope. Perhaps it was simply cruel of him to let her hope in the first place. Outside, A branch cracked somewhere in the woods, and Elena flinched, pressing herself further into the corner of the gatehouse. She told herself it was only the storm. Nothing more. And yet a small part of her, the part that had grown used to being careful in a house full of secrets, kept listening for footsteps. Meanwhile, back at the Ashford estate, chaos had begun to stir beneath the surface of the celebration. A maid had gone to fetch the bride for the final preparations, and found the room empty, the window slightly open, a single silver hairpin left behind on the dressing table. Word passed quietly from servant to servant, careful not to alarm the guests, until it reached the ears of the one person who needed to know most urgently. Adrian had been standing near the fireplace, speaking with a group of lords about matters that meant nothing to him in that moment, when his steward, a quiet and loyal man named Edmund, pulled him aside and whispered the news. Adrian's face did not change in front of the guests, years of training and composure keeping his expression calm, but inside, something sharp and sudden gripped his chest. He excused himself and walked swiftly toward Elena's room, his mind racing through every possibility. Had she simply stepped out for air? Had something frightened her? He reached her chamber and saw for himself what the maid had described. The open window, the single hairpin, the absence of the woman he had spent months trying to protect, in ways she did not yet understand, and he had not yet found the courage to explain. Adrian stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the edge of the dressing table, his thoughts spinning backward through the events of the evening. He remembered the study. He remembered Margot's visit only an hour earlier, her insistence on speaking with him privately, her tone sharp and demanding when he tried to end the conversation quickly. He remembered saying things he did not mean, playing along with a role he despised, because Margot held something over him that he could not yet reveal to anyone, not even to Elena. He closed his eyes, understanding all at once what must have happened. Someone had overheard, and judging by the timing, by the empty room, by the storm outside, that someone could only have been Elena herself. He did not wait for permission or explanation. He grabbed his coat from where it hung by the door and moved quickly through the halls, ignoring the questions from guests who noticed his hurried pace. He stepped out into the rain without hesitation, calling for a horse, his mind fixed on only one goal. He had to find her before she went too far, before the storm or her own fear led her somewhere dangerous, before she disappeared from his life, the way he feared she might, forever believing the worst of him. The rain struck his face as he rode out from the stables, the horse's hooves splashing through puddles that had formed along the path. He searched the obvious places first, the main road leading toward the village, the small orchard where she sometimes liked to walk in quieter hours. Nothing, no sign of her. He called her name into the wind, though he doubted she would hear him even if she was close, the storm swallowing every sound but its own fury. After nearly an hour of searching, soaked through and growing desperate, Adrian noticed a faint light flickering near the old gatehouse at the edge of the property, a building he had almost forgotten still existed. It was not the light of a lantern, exactly, more like the reflection of distant lightning against a window that should have been dark and empty for years. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the small stone structure, his heart pounding with something that felt almost like fear, though he told himself Dukes did not feel fear, not over something as simple as a missing bride. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the old wood. Inside, Elena heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the rain, heavy and deliberate, not the quick scattered steps of a frightened animal, but the steady stride of a person who knew exactly where they were going. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the far wall, gripping the edge of an old wooden shelf for support, unsure whether to call out or stay silent and hope whoever it was would pass by without noticing the gatehouse at all. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a long pause, long enough that Elena began to wonder if she had imagined the sound entirely. Then the door creaked open, and lightning flashed behind the figure standing in the frame, illuminating him for just a moment, before darkness swallowed the light again. She knew that outline. She knew that height, that posture, even soaked through and half hidden in shadow. Her heart sank and raced at the same time, a strange mixture of relief that she was no longer alone in the storm, and dread that the very person she had run from had somehow found her so quickly. Adrian stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair and his coat. his eyes adjusting to the darkness inside the gatehouse until he found her, curled against the wall, watching him, with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not sadness. Not fear exactly. Something colder. Something that told him she already knew far more than he had hoped she would ever discover. At least not like this. Not without him having the chance to explain it first. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The rain filled the silence between them, drumming against the roof, running in small rivers down the cracked window pane. Elena finally broke the silence, her voice steady despite everything trembling inside her. She asked him how he had found her so quickly. Adrian stepped further into the gatehouse, careful to keep some distance between them, sensing that closing that gap too quickly would only make things worse. He said he had searched every path he could think of, and something had told him to check this old building, a place he had not visited since he was a boy, exploring the grounds with his brothers. Elena studied his face for any sign of the coldness she had heard in his voice earlier that evening, any trace of the man who had spoken so carelessly about her worth, being tied to land and money rather than affection. She found only exhaustion, worry, and something that looked almost like guilt, though she was not yet ready to trust her own reading of his expression. She asked him, quietly but firmly, whether he had meant the things he said to Margot in the study. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had known this moment would come eventually, though he had hoped for more time to prepare his words, to find a way to explain the truth without making it sound like a poor excuse for cruelty. Now, standing in a cold gatehouse in the middle of a storm, with the woman he was supposed to marry looking at him as though she expected him to confirm every fear she carried, he understood there was no more time left to wait. He took a slow breath and told her that nothing she heard was the whole truth, though he understood why it must have sounded exactly like betrayal. He said Margot had come to him with a threat, one he had not yet found a way to counter, and that everything he said in that study had been carefully chosen to protect a secret that, if revealed too soon, could destroy far more than just their wedding day. Elena's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted so desperately to believe him, and that desire frightened her more than the storm outside ever could. She had believed him before, believed in his laughter, his kindness, his interest in the things she cared about, and all of that belief had led her to a locked door and words that cut deeper than she thought words could cut. She asked him what threat could possibly be worth speaking about her, as though she were nothing more than a piece of land, to be transferred from one owner to another. Adrian's eyes softened, though pain flickered behind them, the kind of pain that came from carrying a burden alone for far too long. He said he could not tell her everything yet, not because he did not trust her, but because the moment he spoke the full truth aloud, it would put her in danger she did not yet understand. Danger connected to matters far beyond their small disagreement in a rain-soaked gatehouse. Elena felt anger rising beneath her sadness, a sharp frustration at being asked once again to trust without explanation, to wait patiently for answers that never seemed to come when she needed them most. She told him she was tired of being kept in the dark, tired of smiling through gatherings and pretending everything was well, while everyone around her seemed to know more about her own future than she did. Adrian took a step closer, though he stopped himself before crossing the space that still separated them, respecting the wall she had built in the last few minutes, even as he longed to break it down with the truth he was still not ready to share. He told her that if she gave him time, real time, not the rushed hours before a wedding that was arranged more for politics than affection, he would find a way to fix everything, to expose whoever was truly behind this threat and free them both from the shadow it cast over their lives. Elena studied his face for a long moment, rain still dripping from strands of his dark hair, his eyes pleading in a way she had never seen from him before. Something in her chest ached at the sight, some part of her heart that refused to fully believe the coldness she had heard in his voice earlier that evening was the whole truth of who he was. But another part of her, the part that had grown up watching her father make careful decisions about who to trust in a world full of hidden agendas, told her that trust given too quickly could be more dangerous than trust withheld entirely. She told him she needed time, just as he was asking for time from her. She told him she could not simply return to the house tonight and pretend the last few hours had not happened, could not stand before guests and speak vows to a man whose true intentions she had only just begun to question. She needed distance and clarity and a chance to think without his presence clouding every decision she tried to make. Adrian's expression shifted, disappointment and understanding mixing together in equal measure. He told her he would not force her to return, though every instinct in him wanted to insist she stay somewhere safe, somewhere he could protect her, while the storm outside and the storm inside their lives both settled. He asked only that she allow him to escort her somewhere safe for the night, rather than leaving her to wander alone through unfamiliar paths in weather this dangerous. Elena hesitated, weighing the offer against her pride, against her fear, against the exhaustion that had begun to settle deep into her bones, now that the initial shock of everything had started to fade into simple physical need for warmth and rest. Finally she agreed, though she made it clear that accepting his help tonight did not mean she had forgiven him, did not mean the questions burning inside her had been answered in any way that satisfied her. Adrian nodded, understanding completely, grateful simply that she had not refused him outright, and vanished further into a storm that could easily have swallowed someone smaller and more fragile than the strength he had always admired in her, even when she herself did not fully recognize how strong she truly was. He led her out of the gatehouse, offering his coat despite her initial protest, insisting the fabric would do more good keeping her warm than staying dry on his own shoulders. They walked together toward where he had left his horse, the rain finally beginning to ease into a lighter drizzle, as though the storm itself understood that the worst of this particular night had already passed, even if the larger storm surrounding their lives had only just begun. As they moved through the darkness, Elena stole a glance at the man beside her, the man she had been ready to marry only hours before, the man whose words had shattered something inside her chest that she was not yet sure could be repaired. She did not know yet whether the explanation he promised would be enough to heal what had broken. She did not know whether the danger he spoke of was real, or simply another convenient excuse, crafted to soothe her anger. But she knew one thing, with absolute certainty, as they walked together, beneath a sky, slowly clearing of storm clouds. Whatever happened next, she would not simply accept whatever story she was told without proof. She had spent enough of her life trusting blindly. Tonight, in the cold and the rain, something inside Elena Whitmore had changed, and she intended to find the truth herself, no matter how long it took or how many secrets stood in her way. They reached the horse in silence, the only sound between them the softening rain and the distant rumble of thunder retreating over the hills. Adrian helped her onto the saddle first, then climbed up behind her, careful to keep a respectful distance, even in the closeness the ride required. Neither of them spoke as they moved away from the gatehouse, away from the house glowing faintly in the distance, toward a small inn Adrian knew on the edge of the village, a place quiet enough to offer her privacy for the night while he began working, in secret, to unravel the threat that had cost them both so much already. Elena stared out at the darkened countryside as they rode, her mind replaying every word from the study, every promise Adrian had just made in the gatehouse, every fear that told her she might be walking straight back into another trap disguised as safety. She did not know yet who to trust completely. She only knew that the woman who had run through that storm hours earlier was not the same woman, riding quietly through the clearing rain now, and whatever came next, she intended to face it with open eyes rather than blind hope. The inn appeared ahead of them, a small building, with warm light glowing from its windows, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the night sky. Adrian slowed the horse as they approached, glancing once more at Elena, searching her face for any sign of what she might be feeling, any indication of whether the fragile truce between them might hold until morning, or shatter the moment they parted ways. Elena said nothing, but she did not pull away when he helped her down from the horse, and she did not refuse when he insisted on speaking with the innkeeper himself to arrange a private room for her, promising to return at first light with answers she desperately needed, and he was finally ready to provide. As she watched him disappear into the darkness toward his waiting horse, Elena wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders and allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing the house hours before, to breathe fully, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but certain that she would face it with far more caution than she had carried into today. Morning came slowly over the village, the sky washed pale and clean after the storm, puddles scattered across the road reflecting soft gray light. Elena had barely slept, sitting near the small window of her room at the inn most of the night, watching the rain fade into mist and then into nothing at all. Her mind would not rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Adrian's voice from the study, cold and calculating, followed immediately by his voice from the gatehouse, pleading and desperate. She could not decide which version of him was real, or if perhaps both were true in different ways, each shaped by pressures she did not yet understand. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the hills, washing her face with water from a basin left by the innkeeper's wife, a kind woman named Beatrice, who had asked no questions the night before beyond whether Elena needed anything for comfort. Elena had thanked her quietly and said only that she needed rest, unwilling to explain that the woman standing before her, still wearing the remains of a ruined wedding gown, had fled her own marriage only hours earlier. She changed into a simple dress Beatrice had offered, plain brown wool far removed from silk and lace, and found she preferred it. The gown from the night before now felt like a costume from a life she was no longer certain she wanted to return to. A soft knock came at her door just as the sun climbed fully over the rooftops. She opened it carefully and found Adrian standing in the hallway, dressed simply as well, his usual fine coats and polished boots replaced with something plainer, as though he too understood that whatever conversation was about to happen deserved honesty stripped of decoration. He asked if she had slept. She told him honestly that she had not really. He nodded, understanding, and asked if she was ready to hear the truth, all of it this time, without half explanations or careful evasions, meant to protect her from things he now realized she deserved to know, regardless of the danger involved. Elena stepped aside and led him into the small room, gesturing to a chair near the window while she remained standing, arms folded, unwilling to soften her posture until she heard something that earned that softness. Adrian sat down slowly, running a hand through his hair, gathering his thoughts before he finally began to speak. He told her that 6 months earlier, his family's finances had taken a severe blow after a series of failed investments made by his late uncle, investments that had drained resources meant to sustain the estate for generations. He had kept this quiet, ashamed of the failure attached to his family name, working instead behind the scenes to recover what he could without alerting the wider nobility to how fragile his position truly was. He explained that during this difficult period, Margot had approached him with an offer that seemed harmless at first. She claimed to have connections that could help restore his family's finances quietly, without public embarrassment, in exchange for a small favor involving certain documents related to the marriage arrangement between him and Elena. He admitted, with visible shame, that he had agreed without fully understanding what she intended to do with those documents, until it was already too late to undo the arrangement cleanly. Elena's arms tightened across her chest as she listened, torn between sympathy for the pressure he described and frustration that he had allowed himself to be pulled into secrecy without ever telling her, the person most affected by decisions being made entirely behind her back. Adrian continued, his voice lower now, admitting that Margot had used those documents to blackmail him further once she realized how much leverage she truly held. She threatened to expose forged records suggesting Adrian had knowingly deceived Elena's father about the family's financial stability, records that could destroy not only his reputation, but potentially Elena's family's standing as well, since her father had already publicly praised the match as beneficial for both households. He said the conversation Elena overheard in the study had been Margot testing him, demanding he speak in a way that proved his loyalty to her scheme rather than to Elena, threatening to release the forged records immediately if he refused to play along convincingly enough. He had chosen his words carefully in that moment, trying to satisfy Margot's demands just enough to buy himself time to find another solution, never imagining that Elena herself would be standing close enough to hear every cruel word he forced himself to say. Elena's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall, anger and heartbreak swirling together as she processed everything he had just revealed. She asked him, voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain composed, why he had not simply told her the truth from the very beginning, before any of this reached the point of threats and forged documents and cruel words spoken in a locked study. Adrian's expression crumbled slightly, guilt written clearly across his face. He admitted that pride had played a larger role than he wished to acknowledge, along with genuine fear that revealing his family's financial troubles so early in their courtship might have changed how she and her father viewed the entire arrangement. He said he had convinced himself he could fix everything quietly, protect her from the ugliness of it all, and present himself to her only once the danger had passed, a plan that now seemed foolish and deeply flawed in hindsight. Elena studied him for a long moment, the morning light catching the exhaustion etched into his face, the sincerity that seemed to shine through despite everything. She wanted to believe him completely, wanted to let go of the anger still burning in her chest, and simply trust that circumstances beyond his control had led them both to this painful place. But a part of her, the more cautious part, shaped by years of watching politics unfold in her father's household, reminded her that words alone were not proof, no matter how convincing they sounded. She told him she needed more than his explanation. She needed to see evidence, something concrete, that confirmed Margot's involvement, beyond his word alone. Something that would allow her to understand the full scope of the danger they were both facing, before she decided how to move forward, whether that meant returning to her family, confronting Margot directly, or continuing to distance herself from everyone connected to this tangled situation. Adrian nodded immediately, relieved that she was willing to consider the possibility of trusting him again, even if that trust remained conditional for now. He told her he had already begun quietly gathering information, working with his loyal steward Edmund to trace the origins of the forged documents Margot had used against him. He believed there might be a way to prove the forgery conclusively, which would not only clear his name, but expose Margot's true intentions to the rest of the family, before she could cause further damage. Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing the risks of staying involved against the deeper danger of walking away entirely, and leaving Margot free to continue whatever scheme she had set into motion. Finally, she told Adrian that she wanted to help uncover the truth herself, rather than simply waiting somewhere safe, while others decided her fate around her once again. Adrian hesitated, clearly wanting to protect her from any further danger, but something in her expression told him that arguing against her involvement would only push her further away, rather than bringing them closer to resolving this together. He agreed, on the condition that she remain cautious and allow him to handle any direct confrontations with Margot, at least until they had gathered enough proof to protect themselves fully. They spent the remainder of the morning discussing what steps to take next. Adrian explained that Edmund had already identified an old family solicitor named Nathaniel, who had handled financial records for both the Ashford and Whitmore families for decades. If anyone could recognize inconsistencies in the documents Margot had used, it would be Nathaniel, given his long history with the paperwork involved in both estates. Elena suggested that she might be able to approach Margot indirectly, through her own household connections, gathering information about her recent activities, without revealing that Adrian and Elena had already begun working together to expose her. She knew Margot well enough to understand her patterns, her tendency toward overconfidence once she believed a scheme was working smoothly. As they finalized their plans, a knock came at the door once again, this time from the innkeeper's wife Beatrice, who informed them nervously that riders had arrived from the Whitmore estate, searching the village for any sign of the missing bride. Elena's stomach tightened at the news. She was not yet ready to face her father, not until she understood the full truth and could speak to him without her voice shaking from uncertainty. Adrian moved quickly, suggesting they leave the inn immediately through a back entrance before the riders reached this particular street. Elena gathered the few things she had with her, the ruined wedding gown left folded in a corner she never intended to retrieve, and followed him out into the cool morning air, moving carefully along a narrow path behind the buildings that led toward the edge of the village. They found Adrian's horse waiting where he had left it the night before, and within moments, they were riding away from the village, toward a small cottage on the outskirts of Ashford lands, that Adrian said belonged to Edmund's family, a place quiet enough to serve as a temporary refuge, while they continued piecing together the truth behind Margot's scheme. As they rode, Elena found herself studying the back of Adrian's shoulders, the tension visible in how he held himself, clearly carrying the weight of decisions he wished he had made differently from the very beginning. She still did not fully trust him, not completely, not yet. But something had shifted since the previous night, a small crack of understanding opening between the anger and the hurt, allowing space for the possibility that perhaps they had both been victims of the same careful manipulation, orchestrated by someone far more dangerous than either of them had initially realized. They arrived at the small cottage just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. The modest stone building surrounded by a garden, overgrown with wildflowers, clearly cared for by hands that valued simple beauty over grand display. Edmund was already waiting for them, having received word earlier that morning that his master intended to bring the missing bride to this quiet refuge, while they worked together to uncover the truth. Edmund greeted Elena with careful respect, clearly aware of the sensitive nature of everything unfolding around them. He led them inside, where a modest fire burned in the hearth, and a simple meal had already been prepared, more out of practical necessity than any attempt at impressing the woman who had, until recently, been expected to become the lady of a grand estate, rather than a guest hiding in a humble cottage. As they settled around the small table, Edmund revealed information he had gathered earlier that morning, details that added new weight to the situation. He explained that Margot had been seen meeting privately with a man from a rival noble family, someone with a long-standing grudge against the Ashford name, due to old disputes over land boundaries decades earlier. This connection suggested that Margot's scheme was not simply about securing a marriage to Adrian for her own gain, but possibly part of a larger plan involving this rival family, one that could have far more serious consequences than either Elena or Adrian had initially imagined. Elena listened carefully, her mind working through the implications of this new information. If Margot was working with an outside party who held old grudges against Adrian's family, then the threat extended far beyond a simple scheme to secure a wealthy marriage. It suggested a deliberate attempt to destroy the Ashford name entirely, using Elena's own trust and naivety as one of the tools in a larger, more calculated attack. She turned to Adrian, asking directly whether he had any knowledge of this rival family, or the history of the land dispute Edmund had mentioned. Adrian's expression darkened slightly as he explained that the dispute in question had occurred generations earlier, before his own birth, involving a contested boundary line that had once belonged to his grandfather. The rival family, the Hartleys, had never fully accepted the outcome of that dispute, and rumors had persisted for years that they waited patiently for an opportunity to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the fire nearby. If the Hartleys were involved, working alongside Margot to destroy the Ashford name and reclaim old land through manipulation and forged documents, then the danger surrounding this entire situation was far greater than a personal betrayal between a bride and groom. It was a calculated attack designed to unravel generations of history, and she and Adrian now found themselves caught directly in the middle of it. Adrian stood from the table, pacing slowly near the fire, his mind clearly working through the new implications of everything they had just learned. He said that if the Hartleys were truly involved, then Nathaniel the solicitor might hold even more critical information than they initially realized, given his long history handling documents connected to both families and the old land dispute in question. Elena agreed that speaking with Nathaniel as quickly as possible seemed like the most important next step. Edmund offered to send word ahead, arranging a private meeting that would avoid drawing attention from either Margot or anyone connected to the Hartley family, who might be watching for signs that their scheme had been discovered. As the afternoon light shifted through the cottage windows, Elena found herself feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. The path ahead was clearly more dangerous and complicated than she had imagined the night before, fleeing through the storm with nothing but heartbreak weighing on her mind. But for the first time since overhearing that conversation in the study, she felt a flicker of purpose beginning to replace the despair. A sense that uncovering this truth might not only clear Adrian's name and expose Margot's betrayal, but also protect both of their families from a danger neither of them had fully understood until now. She looked over at Adrian, meeting his eyes across the small room, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that felt less like suspicion and more like the beginning of an alliance built on shared purpose rather than blind trust. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it together, carefully and cautiously, but together nonetheless. The meeting with Nathaniel was arranged for the following evening, in a small office above a bookshop at the far end of the village, chosen specifically because it drew little attention from passers-by and had no direct connection to either the Ashford or Whitmore households. Elena spent the day before the meeting, trying to steady her nerves, walking slowly through the wildflower garden behind Edmund's cottage, going over every detail Adrian had shared with her, searching for any piece that did not quite fit. Adrian, meanwhile, had ridden out early that morning to speak quietly with a few trusted contacts among the merchants who supplied goods to both the Ashford and Hartley estates. He returned, just before midday, with troubling news. Several merchants had mentioned, almost in passing, that recent orders from the Hartley estate had increased significantly in the past few months, particularly orders involving fine paper and specialized inks, the kind used by scribes trained in matching handwriting and official seals. Elena's stomach turned as she listened to this detail. It suggested, quite clearly, that the Hartleys had been preparing forged documents for some time, likely well before Margot ever approached Adrian with her supposed offer to help restore his family's finances. This was not a hasty scheme born from opportunity. It had been planned carefully, patiently, over months, perhaps even longer. That evening, they made their way to the small office above the bookshop, Edmund staying close behind them, as a quiet guard against any unwanted attention. Nathaniel greeted them with the calm demeanor of a man accustomed to handling delicate matters with discretion, his gray hair and steady hands giving an immediate sense of trustworthiness that put Elena slightly more at ease, despite the tension coiled tightly in her chest. Nathaniel had already reviewed the copies of documents Edmund had managed to obtain earlier, comparing them carefully against older records he kept from decades of service to both families. He explained, adjusting his spectacles as he spread the papers across his desk, that the handwriting on the falsified financial records did indeed differ subtly from Adrian's authentic signature, a difference so small that only someone deeply familiar with both samples could recognize it clearly. He also pointed out inconsistencies in the wax seal used on several of the documents, explaining that the pattern pressed into the wax did not perfectly match the official seal belonging to the Ashford family, suggesting a skilled but imperfect forgery. Elena leaned closer, studying the documents herself, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed anger as the proof of Margot's deception became increasingly clear before her eyes. Nathaniel continued, explaining that he recognized the particular style of forgery from a case decades earlier, one involving a dispute between two other noble families, where a scribe connected to the Hartley household had been discreetly dismissed after being caught altering property records in a similar fashion. He believed this same scribe, now much older, but likely still active in secretive circles, may have been hired again by the Hartleys to produce the false documents currently being used to blackmail Adrian and manipulate the entire situation between the two families. This revelation gave them something concrete to pursue, a potential witness who could confirm the forgery directly if they managed to locate him and convince him to speak honestly about his involvement. Nathaniel agreed to make quiet inquiries among his old contacts to determine whether this scribe could still be found and whether he might be persuaded to cooperate, given the seriousness of the situation now unfolding. As they left the office later that evening, walking quietly through the darkened streets back toward the edge of the village, Elena found herself thinking about her father, wondering how he was coping with her sudden disappearance, wondering what lies Margot might already be spreading to explain her absence and turn the family further against her. She mentioned this concern to Adrian as they walked, her voice heavy with worry despite her determination to remain focused on uncovering the truth. Adrian assured her that Edmund had a trusted contact within the Whitmore household staff who could quietly relay messages back and forth, without alerting Margot, or anyone else, to the fact that Elena remained safe and actively working to expose the scheme against them both. He promised that once they had gathered enough proof, they would present everything directly to her father, allowing him to understand the full truth, rather than relying on whatever version of events Margot had likely already begun spreading among the household. Elena felt some comfort in this reassurance, though worry still lingered heavily in her chest. She had grown up believing her father to be a wise and careful man, someone who valued loyalty and honesty above social standing or political convenience. But she also understood how persuasive Margot could be when she wanted something badly enough, and she feared how much damage might already be done to her father's trust before they managed to reveal the truth clearly enough to undo it. Over the following days, they continued gathering evidence carefully, Nathaniel eventually locating the retired scribe through his old contacts, a nervous elderly man named Oliver, who lived quietly on the outskirts of a neighboring town, clearly hoping to avoid any further involvement in the schemes of powerful families. Convincing him to speak honestly proved difficult at first, given his understandable fear of retribution from the Hartleys if his cooperation became known. Adrian eventually managed to persuade Oliver by promising protection and a quiet resettlement far from the reach of both feuding families, an offer that finally eased enough of the old scribe's fear for him to agree to provide a written statement, confirming his involvement in forging the documents at the request of a representative from the Hartley household, working alongside Margot to construct false evidence against Adrian's financial dealings. With Oliver's statement in hand, along with Nathaniel's expert analysis of the inconsistencies in the forged documents, Elena and Adrian finally possessed enough concrete proof to confront Margot directly and expose the truth to Elena's father before any further damage could be done to either family's reputation or standing. But even as they celebrated this small victory quietly within the walls of Edmund's cottage, Elena could not shake a growing unease. Something about the scale of this scheme troubled her deeply. If the Hartleys had been planning this for months, carefully preparing forgeries and waiting patiently for the right opportunity, what else might they have prepared as a backup plan should their primary scheme unravel as it now appeared to be doing? She voiced this concern to Adrian that evening, sitting together near the small fire in Edmund's modest sitting room, the proof they had gathered spread carefully across the table between them. Adrian admitted he shared the same worry, acknowledging that families as patient and calculating as the Hartleys rarely relied on a single plan without considering contingencies should things not unfold exactly as intended. They agreed that moving quickly was now essential, before Margot or the Hartleys had any opportunity to realize their scheme had been discovered and shift toward whatever backup plan they might have prepared. Adrian suggested they request an urgent meeting with Elena's father the following morning, presenting the evidence directly and allowing him to decide how best to handle the situation from within his own household, where he held the authority and standing to confront Margot without giving her any warning or opportunity to flee before facing the consequences of her actions. Elena agreed, though nervousness fluttered anxiously in her chest at the thought of finally facing her father again after days away, uncertain exactly how he would react to learning the full truth about the woman he had raised as a stepdaughter, likely trusting her far more than she ever deserved. That night, as the cottage grew quiet and Edmund retired to his own small room, Elena found herself sitting alone near the dying embers of the fire, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body. Adrian found her there sometime later, unable to sleep himself, his mind equally consumed by worry over how the coming confrontation would unfold. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the tension between them from days earlier having softened considerably as they worked side by side toward a shared goal. Finally, Adrian spoke quietly, admitting that regardless of how their confrontation with Margot and her father unfolded the next day, he wanted Elena to know that everything he felt for her before this entire scheme unraveled had been completely genuine, untouched by any financial motive or political convenience, despite how convincingly Margot had forced him to speak otherwise in that fateful conversation in the study. Elena studied his face carefully in the dim firelight, searching for any hint of deception, finding instead only the same quiet sincerity that had drawn her to him in the first place, months earlier at that gathering, where he had asked her about books rather than her family's wealth or connections. She did not fully forgive him yet, not completely, the wound from that overheard conversation still too fresh and raw to disappear entirely. But she found herself believing him now, more fully than she had allowed herself to at any point since fleeing through the storm that fateful night. She told him quietly that she needed to see how tomorrow unfolded before deciding fully what she felt, or how she wished to move forward regarding their engagement and everything that had happened between them. Adrian nodded, respecting her caution, understanding completely that trust once broken required careful rebuilding rather than sudden restoration, simply because circumstances had proven his innocence in this particular deception. They sat together a while longer, watching the fire slowly burn down to glowing embers, both of them silently preparing themselves for whatever confrontation awaited them at the Whitmore estate the following morning. A confrontation that would finally bring the truth into the open and force Margot to face the consequences of a scheme that had nearly destroyed 2 families and countless lives caught within its careful web of lies. The ride back to the Whitmore estate the following morning felt entirely different from the frantic escape through rain and darkness only days earlier. The sky had cleared completely, sunlight spreading gently across fields, still damp from the storm, birds calling from the hedges lining the road, as though nothing troubling had ever happened here at all. Elena rode beside Adrian in silence, clutching a small leather folder containing Oliver's written statement and Nathaniel's careful analysis of the forged documents, her heart pounding steadily with each mile that brought them closer to the confrontation she had both dreaded and anticipated for days. Edmund rode a short distance behind them, having insisted on accompanying them for additional support should Margot or anyone connected to the Hartley family attempt anything unexpected once they realized their scheme had unraveled. Elena appreciated his quiet loyalty, having come to trust him deeply over the past several days spent working together toward uncovering the truth. As the familiar towers of the Whitmore estate came into view, Elena felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of emotions. This had been her home for her entire life, filled with memories of her mother before she passed, of childhood afternoons spent reading in the garden, of her father's quiet affection, expressed more through steady presence than grand declarations. She had never imagined leaving this place under circumstances so painful, nor returning to it carrying evidence that would shatter whatever careful lies Margot had constructed in her absence. They approached the main entrance just as a groundskeeper noticed their arrival, his eyes widening with visible surprise and relief at the sight of Elena alive and well. He hurried inside immediately, clearly intent on alerting the household to her return, before she had even dismounted from her horse. Within moments, the front doors opened, and Elena's father emerged, his face pale with days of worry, his eyes filling instantly with tears at the sight of his daughter safely returned. He rushed forward, pulling her into an embrace before she had even fully dismounted, his voice trembling as he asked repeatedly if she was hurt, if she was well, where she had been all this time, his relief so overwhelming that questions tumbled from him faster than she could possibly answer them. Elena held her father tightly, feeling her own eyes fill with tears at the genuine warmth and worry in his embrace, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness she had witnessed in that study only days earlier. She assured him gently that she was safe, unharmed, and that she had come home now, because she carried something urgent she needed him to see and understand immediately. Her father's expression shifted from relief to confusion as he noticed Adrian standing a short distance behind her, his posture respectful but tense, clearly bracing himself for whatever reaction might follow once the full truth came to light. Elena's father looked between the two of them, his brow furrowing with growing concern as he sensed something significant had occurred. Something far beyond a simple case of wedding day nerves or a bride's momentary fear. Elena took a steadying breath and told her father plainly that they needed to speak privately, immediately, regarding matters that concerned not only her broken engagement, but also serious deception being carried out within their own household. Her father's face grew serious, and he nodded, leading them quickly toward his private study, the same room where important family matters had always been discussed, away from the ears of servants and guests alike. Once inside, with the door firmly closed behind them, Elena laid out the leather folder on her father's desk, carefully explaining everything that had transpired since she fled the wedding, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the story she needed to tell. She described overhearing the conversation in the Ashford study, the cruel words that had shattered her trust completely, and then the truth Adrian had since revealed regarding Margot's blackmail, and the deeper scheme involving the Hartley family's long-standing grudge over old land disputes. Her father listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting through disbelief, anger, and finally a heavy sorrow, as the full scope of the betrayal became clear before him. He picked up Oliver's written statement, reading it carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the confirmation that his own stepdaughter had conspired with a rival family to manipulate and blackmail the man his own daughter had been set to marry, all while allowing Elena to believe her wedding was simply a genuine union built on mutual affection and family alliance. When he finally looked up from the documents, his eyes were hard with a controlled fury Elena had rarely witnessed in her father before. He asked quietly where Margot currently was, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that suggested the depth of his anger ran far deeper than his composed exterior revealed. Before Elena could answer, a soft knock came at the study door, followed immediately by Margot's voice calling out cheerfully, clearly unaware of the confrontation waiting for her inside. She had apparently heard word of Elena's return and had come to offer what likely would have been a carefully rehearsed performance of relief and sisterly concern, entirely unaware that the truth behind her scheme had already been laid bare before the very man whose trust she had so carefully manipulated for months. Elena's father called for her to enter, his voice giving no indication of the fury simmering beneath his controlled tone. Margot stepped into the study, her expression arranged into practiced concern, though her eyes flickered with barely concealed surprise upon noticing Adrian standing quietly near the window, his expression giving nothing away. She began speaking immediately, expressing relief that Elena had returned safely, claiming she had been worried sick over her sister's sudden disappearance, her voice carrying just the right amount of emotional distress to seem entirely genuine to anyone unaware of the truth. Elena watched her with a strange sense of detachment, marveling at how convincingly Margot could perform sincerity when it served her purposes. Elena's father allowed Margot to finish her performance before speaking, his voice calm and measured, as he asked her directly whether she had any knowledge of forged financial documents used to blackmail Duke Adrian Ashford into speaking cruelly about Elena during a private conversation just before the wedding. Margot's expression froze for just a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of panic crossing her features, before she quickly composed herself again, claiming ignorance and expressing confusion over such a strange and serious accusation. Elena's father, however, was no longer willing to accept vague denials. He picked up Oliver's written statement from his desk and read it aloud slowly, watching Margot's face carefully, as each damning detail confirmed her involvement in the scheme, alongside the Hartley family. As the reading continued, Margot's composed expression began to crumble, her carefully maintained mask slipping, to reveal genuine fear and desperation beneath the surface. She attempted to argue that the statement was fabricated, that Oliver was simply a bitter old man, seeking revenge for being dismissed decades earlier from unrelated employment, but her protests carried little conviction, especially once Nathaniel's detailed analysis of the forged documents was presented alongside the written confession. Elena's father listened to Margot's increasingly desperate denials with a heavy expression of disappointment mixed with quiet fury, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the stepdaughter he had raised and trusted for years since marrying her mother. Finally, he spoke firmly, informing Margot that given the overwhelming evidence presented, he could no longer allow her to remain within his household, nor could he ignore the serious consequences her actions demanded, both for the sake of his own family's reputation and for justice regarding the harm caused to Adrian and Elena. Margot's composed facade shattered completely at this declaration, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for understanding, claiming she had only wanted security, and standing equal to what Elena had always been given so easily throughout their years growing up together. She spoke bitterly of feeling overlooked and undervalued within the household, always considered secondary to Elena despite her own efforts to prove her worth and capability. Elena felt a complicated pang of sympathy mixed with lingering anger as she listened to Margot's emotional confession, understanding for the first time some of the resentment that had clearly built over years within her stepsister, resentment that had eventually curdled into something dangerous and destructive, rather than being addressed honestly and openly within the family. Her father, however, remained firm, despite Margot's tearful pleas, explaining calmly that regardless of whatever grievances she felt, resorting to blackmail, forgery, and conspiracy, with a rival family seeking to destroy their household entirely, crossed a line that could not simply be forgiven or excused by claims of feeling overlooked. He informed her that she would need to leave the estate immediately, and that he would be contacting the appropriate authorities regarding the serious nature of her actions, particularly her involvement with the Hartley family's clear intention to cause lasting harm to both households involved. As guards were summoned to escort a devastated and tearful Margot from the property, Elena found herself standing quietly beside her father, watching the culmination of days spent gathering evidence and uncovering painful truths finally reach its resolution. She felt no satisfaction in witnessing her stepsister's downfall, only a heavy sadness at how much pain and betrayal had unfolded within her own family, hidden beneath years of polite gatherings and carefully maintained appearances. Once Margot had been removed from the estate, Elena's father turned to Adrian, his expression softening slightly as he acknowledged the difficult position Adrian had been placed in by Margot's blackmail scheme. He apologized for any suspicion he might have unfairly directed toward Adrian upon first learning of the situation, understanding now that Adrian himself had been as much a victim of this scheme as Elena had been, forced into cruel words and difficult choices by circumstances entirely beyond his control. Adrian accepted the apology graciously, expressing his own regret for not confiding in Elena's father sooner regarding his family's financial troubles and Margot's subsequent blackmail, acknowledging that greater transparency from the very beginning might have prevented much of the pain and confusion that had unfolded over recent days. Elena's father nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention toward Elena herself, asking gently what she wished to do now that the truth had been fully revealed and Margot's scheme exposed completely. He made clear that regardless of her decision regarding her engagement to Adrian, she would always have a home and place within their family, and that no pressure would be placed upon her to continue with a marriage she no longer felt certain about pursuing. Elena looked between her father's gentle, understanding expression and Adrian's hopeful but carefully restrained gaze, feeling the weight of the decision now resting fully in her own hands, free from the manipulation and deception that had clouded everything since that fateful conversation overheard in the Ashford study. She knew this decision required careful thought rather than a hurried response, driven purely by relief that the truth had finally emerged. She told them both, quietly but firmly, that she needed time to process everything that had happened over recent days before deciding how to move forward, whether that meant renewing her engagement with Adrian under entirely different circumstances, built on complete honesty, or choosing a different path entirely for her future. Both her father and Adrian respected this request immediately, understanding that trust, once shattered, required patience and genuine effort to rebuild, rather than a hasty decision made in the immediate aftermath of finally uncovering the truth. As the day drew to a close, Elena retreated to her childhood bedroom for the first time since fleeing days earlier, finally feeling a measure of peace despite the emotional exhaustion weighing heavily upon her. The truth had finally come to light. Margot's betrayal had been exposed, but the deeper question of her own heart, of whether she could fully trust and love Adrian again, despite everything that had happened, remained something only time and careful reflection could answer honestly. 3 days passed quietly at the Whitmore estate, though nothing about those days felt entirely settled. Word arrived on the second morning that Margot had never reached the authorities her father intended to contact. She had vanished from the modest lodging where guards had escorted her, leaving behind only a hastily packed trunk and a note addressed to no one in particular, expressing bitterness rather than remorse for everything she had done. Elena's father was furious upon learning this news, blaming himself for not securing her more carefully before authorities could take proper custody of her. Adrian, however, suspected something far more troubling than simple carelessness. He believed the Hartley family had likely arranged Margot's escape themselves, unwilling to allow her capture and questioning to expose their own involvement any further than it already had through Oliver's confession. This suspicion proved accurate within days, when disturbing news reached the Whitmore estate from a neighboring village. The patriarch of the Hartley family, an aging but still formidable man named Arthur Hartley, had begun quietly petitioning a regional court, claiming ownership over a significant portion of Ashford land based on decades-old boundary records that he insisted had been improperly altered generations earlier in favor of Adrian's grandfather. Adrian received this news with a grim expression, immediately recognizing the pattern unfolding before him. The forged financial documents used to blackmail him had only ever been one piece of a much larger scheme. Now that Margot's involvement had been exposed, and she had fled directly into the protection of the Hartley family, it seemed clear they intended to abandon the blackmail plot entirely and pursue their true goal openly through legal means, using their own version of manipulated historical records to reclaim land they believed had been unjustly taken from their family generations earlier. Elena listened to this development with growing alarm, understanding immediately that the danger facing Adrian and his family had shifted from private manipulation into a public legal battle that could have lasting consequences, regardless of how the recent scandal involving Margot had already unfolded. She realized that simply exposing the blackmail scheme had not been enough to fully neutralize the threat posed by the Hartley family's long-standing ambitions. Adrian explained to her and her father that he needed to return to his own estate immediately, to consult with Nathaniel regarding the original boundary records from decades earlier, hoping to find definitive proof that would counter whatever manipulated documents Arthur Hartley intended to present before the regional court. He asked Elena directly whether she wished to remain at her family's estate to rest and recover from recent events, or whether she preferred to accompany him and continue assisting with uncovering the full truth behind this deepening conspiracy. Elena did not hesitate long before answering. She told him she needed to see this through completely, understanding now that her own involvement in exposing the truth had become as much about protecting her family's honor and safety as it was about resolving her personal feelings toward Adrian himself. Her father, though clearly worried about her safety, given the seriousness of the Hartley family's apparent ambitions, agreed to allow her to accompany Adrian, trusting that Edmund's continued presence would provide additional protection should the situation grow more dangerous. They departed for the Ashford estate the following morning, arriving to find Nathaniel already waiting anxiously, having received word of the Hartley family's legal petition through his own network of contacts among regional solicitors. He led them immediately to a private records room within the Ashford estate, a space filled with generations of documents, ledgers, and maps, detailing the history and boundaries of the family's landholdings. Nathaniel explained that if genuine original records still existed somewhere within these archives, records that predated whatever alterations the Hartley family claimed had occurred, they would provide the strongest possible defense against the legal challenge now being mounted. However, he admitted, with visible frustration, that decades of reorganization and occasional water damage to the older sections of the archive made locating specific historical documents an uncertain and potentially lengthy process. Elena, eager to contribute meaningfully to the search rather than simply waiting anxiously for results, offered to help sort through the older ledgers and maps, having developed a careful eye for detail during her years spent managing her own family's household records alongside her father. Adrian gratefully accepted her assistance, and together with Nathaniel and a small team of trusted household staff, they began the painstaking process of searching through decades of documents for any trace of the original boundary agreements. The search continued for several days, each hour bringing both frustration at documents that proved irrelevant and cautious hope whenever something promising surfaced among the aging pages. During this time, Elena and Adrian found themselves working closely together, side by side for hours at a stretch, their earlier tensions slowly softening into a quiet camaraderie, built on shared purpose and mutual respect for the careful, patient work required to uncover the truth buried within these old records. One evening, as exhaustion began to weigh heavily on everyone involved in the search, Elena discovered a small, water-stained ledger tucked behind a stack of more recent property records, clearly overlooked during previous reorganizations of the archive. Opening it carefully, she found detailed notes handwritten by Adrian's great-grandfather, describing in precise detail the original boundary agreement reached peacefully between the Ashford and Hartley families nearly a century earlier, an agreement that directly contradicted the manipulated version the current Hartley patriarch intended to present before the regional court. Excitement and relief spread quickly through the small group once Nathaniel confirmed the authenticity and significance of this discovery, comparing the handwriting and official markings carefully against other verified historical documents within the archive. This ledger, combined with Oliver's earlier confession regarding the forged financial documents used in the blackmail scheme, provided powerful evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of deception orchestrated by the Hartley family over an extended period, rather than a simple, isolated dispute over unclear historical boundaries. Adrian immediately arranged for Nathaniel to present this evidence formally before the regional court, requesting an expedited hearing, given the serious and deliberate nature of the deception involved. Elena remained closely involved throughout these preparations, her earlier uncertainty about her feelings toward Adrian gradually giving way to a growing admiration for his patience, integrity, and willingness to work tirelessly toward uncovering truth, rather than simply relying on his position and influence to dismiss the Hartley family's claims without proper evidence. As the day of the court hearing approached, tension settled heavily over the Ashford estate. Adrian confided quietly to Elena one evening, as they reviewed final preparations together in the study, that regardless of how the hearing unfolded, he wanted her to know how deeply grateful he was for her courage and determination throughout this entire ordeal, acknowledging that her willingness to seek truth, rather than simply accepting easy answers, had ultimately saved both their families from a much deeper and more lasting harm. Elena felt her heart soften further at his words, recognizing in him now not the cold, calculating man she had briefly glimpsed through the study door days earlier, but the genuine, thoughtful person she had originally been drawn to months before their engagement began. Still, she reminded herself gently that true trust required more than admiration built during a shared crisis. It required time, consistency, and continued honesty extending well beyond the resolution of this particular danger. As night fell before the crucial hearing, Elena found herself standing quietly on the balcony outside her guest chamber within the Ashford estate, gazing out over moonlit gardens, still slightly damp from recent rains. Adrian joined her there after a while, standing a respectful distance away, both of them silently contemplating the uncertain future awaiting them, regardless of how the legal proceedings concluded the following day. He spoke softly, admitting that whatever happened with the court hearing, he hoped she would eventually find it within herself to trust him fully again, not simply as a partner in uncovering dangerous schemes, but as someone worthy of the love and commitment she had once been prepared to offer him on what was meant to be their wedding day. Elena listened quietly, her heart torn between lingering caution and a growing, undeniable warmth she could no longer fully deny or ignore. She did not offer him a definitive answer that night, understanding that such an important decision deserved more time and reflection than a single emotional moment beneath moonlit skies could rightfully provide. But she allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing through that storm days earlier, to imagine a future where trust and love might genuinely be rebuilt between them, stronger and more resilient for having survived the difficult trials they now found themselves facing together. The regional courthouse stood at the center of the largest town within the district, an imposing stone building where disputes between noble families had been settled for generations. On the morning of the hearing, Elena rose early, dressing carefully in a simple but dignified gown lent to her by Adrian's late mother's wardrobe, feeling the weight of the day pressing steadily against her chest as she prepared to witness the culmination of everything they had worked so hard to uncover. Adrian met her in the main hall of the estate, his expression composed, but his eyes betraying the same nervous tension she felt herself. Nathaniel joined them shortly after, carrying a leather case containing the carefully organized evidence they had gathered, including the water-stained ledger detailing the original boundary agreement, Oliver's written confession regarding the forged financial documents, and Nathaniel's own detailed analysis, comparing the authentic historical records against the manipulated version the Hartley family intended to present. They traveled together to the courthouse, Edmund accompanying them as well, having proven himself an invaluable and steady presence throughout the entire ordeal. Upon arriving, Elena noticed a crowd already gathering outside the building, word of the dispute between two prominent noble families having spread quickly throughout the region, drawing curious onlookers eager to witness how such a significant conflict might resolve. Inside the courthouse, they took their seats as the presiding magistrate, an elderly and famously impartial man named Henry Caldwell, called the proceedings to order. Arthur Hartley sat across the chamber, his expression carrying the same calculated confidence Elena had come to associate with schemes built on careful, patient manipulation. Beside him, to Elena's quiet dismay, sat Margot, her posture rigid and defensive, clearly having thrown her lot in fully with the Hartley family's ambitions now that her own scheme against Adrian had been exposed. The hearing began with Arthur Hartley's solicitor presenting their claim, detailing the supposed history of the boundary dispute, and presenting documents that appeared, at first glance, to support their assertion that a significant portion of Ashford land had been improperly claimed by Adrian's grandfather generations earlier. The solicitor spoke confidently, clearly having prepared extensively for this moment, and for a tense while, Elena worried that the magistrate might find the presented evidence convincing enough to rule in the Hartley family's favor. When it came time for Adrian's side to present their case, Nathaniel rose calmly, methodically laying out the evidence they had gathered. He first presented the water-stained ledger, explaining its historical significance and demonstrating through careful comparison of handwriting, ink composition, and paper aging how it clearly predated the documents presented by the Hartley family, proving definitively that the original boundary agreement had been reached peacefully and fairly nearly a century earlier, directly contradicting the manipulated version currently being presented. The magistrate examined the ledger carefully himself, along with additional historical records Nathaniel provided as further corroboration, his expression growing increasingly serious as the strength of the evidence became clear. Arthur Hartley's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched the magistrate's growing skepticism toward his own family's claims. Nathaniel then proceeded to introduce Oliver's written confession regarding the forged financial documents used to blackmail Adrian, explaining how this earlier scheme connected directly to the current legal dispute, revealing a clear pattern of deliberate deception orchestrated by the Hartley family over an extended period, working in coordination with Margot to manipulate both the personal and legal circumstances surrounding Adrian and Elena's engagement. A murmur spread through the courtroom as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to those observing the proceedings. The magistrate called for Oliver himself to be brought forward, having arranged in advance for the elderly scribe to be present and available for direct questioning should his written statement require further verification. Oliver, though visibly nervous standing before such an imposing legal setting, confirmed everything detailed in his written confession, explaining clearly and consistently how representatives from the Hartley family had approached him months earlier, requesting he forge specific financial documents designed to implicate Adrian in deceptive practices regarding his family's finances. Precisely the documents later used by Margot to blackmail Adrian into speaking cruelly during that fateful conversation Elena had overheard. Arthur Hartley's composed demeanor finally cracked under the weight of this direct testimony, his face reddening with barely contained anger as he realized the strength of the case being built against his family's claims. Margot, seated beside him, appeared increasingly distressed, clearly recognizing that her own involvement in the scheme had now been thoroughly and publicly exposed before the entire assembled crowd. The magistrate allowed Arthur Hartley's solicitor an opportunity to respond to this damning testimony, but the arguments offered felt increasingly weak and unconvincing, given the overwhelming evidence presented against them. After a lengthy deliberation, during which the entire courtroom remained tense with anticipation, Magistrate Caldwell finally announced his ruling. He declared clearly and firmly that the evidence presented by Adrian's representatives, particularly the historical ledger and Oliver's direct testimony, conclusively demonstrated that the Hartley family's claim to Ashford land was based entirely on manipulated and forged documentation, part of a deliberate scheme orchestrated in coordination with Margot Whitmore to cause significant harm to both the Ashford and Whitmore families through blackmail, deception, and false legal claims. The magistrate ruled decisively in favor of the Ashford family, dismissing the Hartley family's claim entirely and ordering that formal charges be filed against both Arthur Hartley and Margot Whitmore for their roles in orchestrating this extensive conspiracy. He further ordered that Margot be taken into custody immediately, given her earlier disappearance following her initial exposure at the Whitmore estate. As guards moved forward to detain both Arthur Hartley and Margot, a heavy commotion spread through the courtroom, onlookers murmuring in shock and disbelief at the scale of deception that had just been revealed before them. Margot, finally facing the full consequences of her actions, broke down in tears, pleading desperately for leniency, insisting once again that years of feeling overlooked and undervalued had driven her towards such desperate and destructive choices. Elena watched the scene unfold with a heavy heart, feeling once again that same complicated mixture of anger and sorrow she had experienced during their earlier confrontation at her father's estate. Despite everything Margot had done, despite the pain and danger she had caused, Elena could not fully separate herself from the shared history and complicated family bond that had once connected them, however strained and ultimately broken that bond had become. As Margot was led away by the guards, she caught Elena's eye briefly across the courtroom, her expression carrying a raw mixture of shame, anger, and something that almost resembled regret, though Elena could not be entirely certain whether that regret stemmed from genuine remorse over her actions, or simply from having been caught and exposed so thoroughly before losing everything she had schemed so carefully to gain. Adrian reached for Elena's hand gently as the courtroom slowly began to empty, offering quiet comfort as she processed the heavy emotions stirred by witnessing her stepsister's downfall so publicly and completely. He did not rush her reaction or try to minimize the complicated grief she clearly felt, despite everything Margot had done to betray her trust so deeply. Nathaniel approached them once the crowd had mostly dispersed, his expression relieved, but appropriately somber given the seriousness of everything that had just unfolded. He explained that with this ruling firmly established, both the Ashford and Whitmore families could now begin the process of moving forward, free from the shadow of blackmail, forgery, and manipulation that had threatened to unravel so much over recent weeks. As they finally left the courthouse together, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. The weight of the past several days finally beginning to lift from her shoulders, now that the truth had been fully and publicly established before those who mattered most. She turned to look at Adrian, finding him watching her with a gentle, hopeful expression, clearly wondering what this resolution might mean for the future they had once planned together before everything fell apart. Elena did not have a complete answer for him yet, not in that exact moment. But as they walked together, back toward the carriage, waiting to take them home, she found herself reaching for his hand without fully deciding to do so. A small, quiet gesture that spoke more clearly than any words could about the direction her heart had slowly, carefully, begun to move throughout the difficult days they had faced and overcome together. In the weeks that followed the court ruling, life at both the Ashford and Whitmore estates slowly began to settle into a new, quieter rhythm. News of the Hartley family's exposed conspiracies spread throughout the region, and while the scandal brought a degree of unwanted attention to both families, it also brought a measure of sympathy and respect for how honestly and thoroughly Adrian and Elena had pursued the truth, rather than allowing the situation to remain hidden or unresolved. Elena spent much of this time at her father's estate, using the quiet days to reflect deeply on everything that had happened since that rainy night she fled her own wedding. She spoke often with her father, their relationship growing even closer as they processed together the painful reality of Margot's betrayal and the difficult decisions that now needed to be made regarding her fate following the legal proceedings. Margot, it was eventually decided, would face a period of formal exile from the region rather than harsher punishment, largely due to her father's quiet pleading with the regional authorities, citing her age and the complicated family circumstances that had contributed to her choices, without excusing the seriousness of what she had done. Elena felt a complicated peace with this outcome, understanding that true justice sometimes required balancing accountability with the recognition that people, however deeply flawed, remained capable of learning and changing, given enough time and genuine reflection. During this period of reflection, Elena also spent considerable time visiting her old friend Rosalind in the neighboring village, finding comfort in conversations that had nothing to do with schemes, forged documents, or complicated family politics. Rosalind, always perceptive, noticed quickly how much Elena's feelings toward Adrian had shifted since the ordeal began, though she was careful not to push her friend toward any particular decision, understanding that Elena needed to reach her own conclusions in her own time. Adrian, for his part, respected Elena's need for space and reflection, though he made sure to remain a steady, reliable presence throughout this period, rather than disappearing entirely or pressuring her toward a hasty decision regarding their future together. He visited occasionally, always with her father's knowledge and blessing, bringing small gestures of thoughtfulness rather than grand romantic displays, understanding that rebuilding genuine trust required patience and consistency far more than dramatic declarations. During one such visit, several weeks after the court hearing had concluded, Adrian brought with him a small, carefully wrapped package, presenting it to Elena as they sat together in her father's garden, the same garden where she had spent so many quiet childhood afternoons, reading beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. Inside the package, she found a simple leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting to be filled. He explained quietly that he had thought of her often during the quiet moments between his own responsibilities, managing the aftermath of the Hartley conspiracy, and that he wanted her to have something entirely her own, something not connected to weddings, engagements, or family politics, simply a space where she might record her own thoughts, feelings, and reflections as she continued processing everything that had happened and deciding what she truly wanted for her future. Elena felt genuinely touched by this simple, thoughtful gesture, recognizing in it the same quiet consideration that had first drawn her to Adrian many months earlier, long before any of the recent turmoil had begun. She thanked him sincerely, and they spent the remainder of that afternoon talking easily together, their conversation flowing naturally between lighter topics and deeper reflections, without the heavy tension that had characterized so many of their interactions throughout the recent crisis. As autumn began to settle over the region, bringing cooler winds and the slow turning of leaves throughout the estate gardens, Elena found herself increasingly drawn back toward the possibility of a future with Adrian. though she remained cautious about rushing back into an engagement without first ensuring that the foundation between them had been genuinely and thoroughly rebuilt. She decided, after much careful reflection, to propose something different from the grand, politically arranged wedding that had originally been planned before everything fell apart. She suggested to Adrian, during another quiet visit in her father's garden, that rather than rushing back into a formal engagement, they might instead spend time simply courting each other properly, without the pressure of family expectations or political alliances hanging over their relationship, allowing genuine trust and affection to develop naturally at their own pace. Adrian agreed readily, relieved that Elena remained open to the possibility of a future together, even if that future required patience and careful rebuilding, rather than an immediate return to their original plans. He admitted that he too welcomed the opportunity to know her more deeply and genuinely, free from the shadow of blackmail and manipulation that had clouded so much of their earlier courtship. Over the following months, they spent considerable time together, visiting local markets, walking through the countryside, sharing meals with her father, and occasionally with Rosalind, slowly building a relationship founded on genuine friendship, mutual respect, and gradually deepening affection, rather than the arrangement originally orchestrated between their families for political and financial convenience. Elena found herself writing frequently in the journal Adrian had given her, recording not only her private reflections, but also small moments of joy and connection that emerged naturally throughout this new, unhurried courtship. She wrote about the quiet satisfaction of watching Adrian genuinely listen to her opinions and ideas, treating her thoughts with the same respect and consideration he might offer a trusted advisor, rather than simply a future wife, expected to remain quietly agreeable. She also wrote honestly about her lingering moments of doubt, times when memories of that painful conversation overheard in the study resurfaced unexpectedly, causing brief flickers of insecurity despite everything that had since been resolved. Adrian, whenever she shared these moments of doubt with him directly, responded always with patience and understanding, never dismissing her concerns or growing frustrated with the time required to fully heal from the betrayal she had experienced. As winter approached and the first signs of frost began appearing across the estate gardens, Elena found herself, during a quiet evening walk with Adrian, along the same path where they had first properly gotten to know each other months earlier, before any engagement or family arrangement had complicated things, realizing with quiet certainty that she was ready to move forward with him, not out of obligation or family expectation, but out of genuine, freely chosen love, built carefully over months of honest connection and shared understanding. She shared this realization with him directly, her voice steady and sincere, as she explained how far they had come, since that painful night she fled through the storm. How genuinely she now trusted the man walking beside her, not simply because he had proven his innocence regarding Margot's blackmail scheme, but because he had consistently demonstrated patience, honesty, and genuine respect for her feelings throughout every step of their renewed courtship. Adrian's expression filled with quiet joy and relief as he listened to her words, understanding fully the significance of what she was expressing. He took her hand gently, telling her that he too felt more certain than ever about their future together, grateful beyond words for her willingness to give him a genuine second chance after everything that had happened between them. They stood together quietly for a long moment beneath the darkening winter sky, the first light snowfall of the season beginning to drift gently around them, marking a quiet, peaceful contrast to the violent storm that had once symbolized the painful beginning of their journey toward genuine understanding and renewed trust. Elena smiled softly as snowflakes settled lightly in Adrian's dark hair, feeling a profound sense of peace and rightness settle over her heart, a feeling entirely different from the anxious uncertainty she had carried on her original wedding day months earlier. This time, whatever came next between them would be built on truth, patience, and genuine choice, rather than family arrangement or hidden agendas. As they turned to walk back toward the warmth of her father's estate together, Elena found herself already looking forward to what the future might hold, confident now that whatever challenges arose, she and Adrian would face them honestly and openly together, having already proven through the difficult trials of recent months that their connection could withstand far more than either of them had initially imagined possible. By early spring, nearly a year after Elena had first fled her own wedding through a violent storm, preparations for a new celebration had quietly begun. Though this time, everything about the arrangement felt entirely different from the rushed, politically motivated wedding originally planned between the Ashford and Whitmore families. Elena and Adrian had spent the winter months deepening their understanding of each other, and when Adrian finally proposed again, kneeling beside the same garden path where they had shared so many honest conversations throughout their renewed courtship, Elena accepted with genuine joy, rather than the nervous uncertainty that had characterized her original engagement. This time, rather than planning an enormous, elaborate ceremony designed to impress the wider nobility and secure political alliances, Elena requested something smaller and more intimate, a celebration focused genuinely on the people who mattered most to both of them, rather than a grand political spectacle. Her father agreed readily, understanding completely why she preferred this quieter, more meaningful approach given everything she had experienced. Rosalind was, of course, invited as one of the closest guests, along with Edmund and Nathaniel, both of whom had become trusted friends through the difficult trials of the previous year, rather than simply loyal household staff. Even Oliver, the elderly scribe whose brave testimony had helped expose the truth behind the Hartley conspiracy, received a personal invitation from Adrian, who felt genuine gratitude for the courage Oliver had shown, despite his understandable fear of retribution. As the wedding day approached, Elena found herself reflecting often on how dramatically her life had changed since that stormy night she had fled through the rain, uncertain and heartbroken, believing her entire future had been built upon a foundation of lies and manipulation. She realized now, looking back with the clarity that time and genuine healing had provided, that fleeing that night had not been an act of weakness or fear, but rather the first courageous step toward discovering a truth that ultimately led her toward a relationship far stronger and more genuine than anything she could have imagined on that original wedding day. The morning of her second wedding day arrived clear and bright, sunlight streaming gently through her bedroom window as she prepared herself, this time surrounded by genuine excitement and anticipation, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had characterized her original preparations. Rosalind helped her dress, both of them laughing softly together as they recalled the dramatic events of the past year, finding it easier now to find moments of lightness and humor even within memories that had once felt overwhelmingly painful. As Elena studied her reflection in the mirror, dressed in a simpler but no less beautiful gown than her original wedding dress, she felt none of the dread or uncertainty that had gripped her exactly 1 year earlier. Instead, she felt only quiet confidence and genuine anticipation for the life she was about to build with a man she now trusted completely, having witnessed firsthand his integrity, patience, and genuine care throughout even the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The ceremony itself took place in the same garden where Adrian had proposed to her for the second time, surrounded by blooming spring flowers and the small, intimate gathering of family and friends who had supported them throughout their difficult journey toward this moment. Elena's father walked her down a simple path lined with fresh flowers, his expression filled with genuine joy and pride, rather than the anxious hope for political advantage that had colored his expression during her original wedding preparations. As she reached Adrian standing before their gathered friends and family, Elena felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, recognizing clearly in his warm, genuine smile the same kindness and sincerity that had first drawn her to him many months earlier, before any of the painful complications from Margot's scheme had ever entered their lives. This time, when she spoke her vows, she meant every single word completely, without any lingering doubt or uncertainty clouding her heart. Adrian, in turn, spoke his own vows with quiet, genuine emotion, acknowledging openly before their gathered guests the mistakes and difficult choices that had nearly cost him the relationship he now treasured more deeply than anything else in his life. He promised Elena complete honesty and partnership moving forward, acknowledging that true love required not just genuine affection, but also the courage to communicate openly, rather than making unilateral decisions meant to protect a partner from difficult truths. As they exchanged these heartfelt vows beneath the clear spring sky, surrounded by blooming flowers and the warm presence of those who had supported them throughout their difficult journey, Elena found herself thinking briefly of that stormy night nearly a year earlier, when she had run desperately through the rain, believing her future had been irreparably shattered by betrayal and deception. She realized now, standing here in this peaceful garden with Adrian's hand held gently in hers, that sometimes the most painful moments in life carried within them the seeds of something far more valuable and genuine than what might have been achieved without such difficult trials. Her flight through that storm had not led her away from love, but rather had guided her, through painful discovery and careful rebuilding, toward a deeper, more authentic connection than she could have possibly imagined on that original wedding day. As their small gathering of friends and family celebrated together following the ceremony, sharing a simple but joyful meal within the estate's dining hall, Elena found herself surrounded by genuine warmth and connection, rather than the careful political posturing that had characterized so many gatherings throughout her earlier life among the nobility. She watched her father laughing warmly with Nathaniel and Edmund, watched Rosalind chatting animatedly with some of Adrian's closest household staff, and felt profound gratitude for the genuine community of support that had carried her and Adrian through their difficult journey toward this joyful moment. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began departing gradually into the gentle spring twilight, Elena and Adrian found a quiet moment alone together in the same garden where they had exchanged their vows only hours earlier. They walked slowly along the familiar path, hand in hand, reflecting quietly on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this peaceful, joyful moment. Adrian spoke softly, admitting that he sometimes still felt a lingering sense of guilt over the pain his initial silence and poor judgment had caused Elena, wishing he had found the courage to confide in her honestly from the very beginning, rather than allowing Margot's blackmail scheme to progress as far as it eventually had. Elena, however, gently reassured him, explaining that while she certainly did not wish to relive the painful trials they had faced together, she had come to genuinely appreciate the strength, honesty, and deeper understanding they had built together, specifically because of the difficult challenges they had overcome side by side. She reminded him softly that true love was rarely tested through easy circumstances alone, but rather revealed its genuine strength and resilience through difficult trials honestly faced and overcome together. Their relationship, she explained, felt stronger and more authentic precisely because it had been built not on convenient assumptions or political arrangements, but on hard-won trust, patience, and genuine partnership forged through real adversity. As twilight deepened into the soft darkness of a clear spring evening, gentle stars beginning to appear overhead, Elena and Adrian paused beneath the same ancient oak tree, where they had first properly gotten to know each other many months earlier, long before any engagement or family arrangement had complicated their budding connection. Adrian gently reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Elena's ear, his expression filled with quiet, genuine adoration. He told her softly that he loved her completely, not for her family's connections or the political advantages their union might once have represented, but simply and entirely for who she was as a person, her courage, her honesty, her willingness to seek difficult truths rather than settling for comfortable illusions. Elena felt her heart swell with genuine happiness as she listened to his heartfelt words, recognizing in them the authentic love she had always hoped to find, now finally and genuinely secured through the difficult trials they had faced and overcome together. She smiled softly, telling him in return that she loved him just as deeply, grateful beyond words for the patience, honesty, and genuine partnership he had shown throughout their difficult journey toward this joyful, peaceful moment. As they stood together beneath the gentle glow of emerging stars, a light, warm spring rain began to fall softly around them, a stark and beautiful contrast to the violent storm that had once symbolized the painful beginning of their story. This time, however, Elena did not run from the rain. Instead, she laughed softly, tilting her face upward to feel the gentle drops against her skin, finally understanding fully how far she had come since that frightened, heartbroken night nearly a year earlier. Adrian laughed warmly beside her, pulling her gently into his arms as the soft rain continued falling around them, both of them standing together, finally home, finally safe, and finally, genuinely, completely in love. They remained there together for a long while, beneath the gentle spring rain, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for every difficult step that had led them honestly and authentically toward this peaceful, joyful moment, ready now to build a genuine, lasting future together, founded not on hidden agendas or family arrangements, but on hard-won trust, patience, and truly authentic love.